Welcome to Fear and Greed's Sunday feature. I'm Michael Thompson. We are right in the middle of grand final weekend across Australia. AFL yesterday afternoon, NRL this evening. So for our Sunday feature, we have dug into the archives and found an interview with one of Australia's greatest broadcasters. Ray Hadley will call the NRL grand final tonight for 9 radios, 2GB and 4BC and regional stations. It will be his 34th grand final, and in doing so, it will break the record that he shares with legendary broadcaster Frank Hyde. Now, a couple of quick things to note about this interview before we get into it. It was recorded back in July of 2020. Now, at that time, Fear and Greed was only a couple of months old. And if I'm honest, you can hear it. We were still finding our feet, and Ray Hadley was good enough to join us and speak with Sean Aylmer in those very early days. So if you notice a couple of microphone crackles and the like, just remember, humble beginnings. And the other thing to note is that this was recorded in the middle of the pandemic, in between lockdowns. And so there was a lot of uncertainty over sport, over everything really, but as discussed in the interview, over the future of sport in this country. And you can really hear that concern coming through. Look, it is a great interview with a fascinating broadcaster. I hope you enjoy it.
My guest this morning is one of the biggest names in the media in this country. Ray Hadley is the most awarded broadcaster in Australian radio history. That's due, at least in part, to his incredible ability to call rugby league in every sport at the Olympics and then host a hugely successful news and current affairs program every weekday morning on radio stations 2GB, 4BC and network stations right across the country. In fact, that program has now been number one in Sydney for 16 consecutive years. With a resume like that, there's any number of things we could talk to him about this morning. So where to begin? Ray Hadley, welcome to Fear and Greed.
Lovely to be with you, Sean. Thank you very much for the invitation.
Let's talk about you first, Ray, before we get into sport. You've dominated the ratings for years now with the Ray Hadley Morning Show. You grill politicians, break news and talk about everything from law and order to sport. Why do you do it? What drives you?
I've had a fascination for radio since I was a boy. I can remember being in year 11 and year 12 when my colleagues were listening to rock radio and I'd listen to John Laws. And then when I went to the regional parts of New South Wales with my grandparents, I'd listen to Gordon Chater and Gwen Plum, who were then on 2GB. It's quite remarkable all these years later I'm now doing the same shift they were doing all those years ago.
Wow.
I've had a fascination for radio, and I was always wanting to be a broadcaster. Initially, it was a race caller. That's what I was to start with from '82 on. And since then, things just went my way. Rugby league presented itself in 1987. Talkback presented itself in 1992, and as I get towards the end of my career, I've been most blessed and most fortunate through those almost 40 years.
For the last 16 years, you've been number one, which is a phenomenal run. What do you put your success down to?
Well, I've got to acknowledge, first of all, Alan Jones, now retired from radio, because I was approached by, well, that's a lie. I shouldn't say approached. I got the sack from Southern Cross. It always sounds nice to say I was approached.
No,
but I was actually
fine.
I was sacked in 2001 by Tony Bell, the MD of Southern Cross, because he didn't think I had much to offer. And I contacted John Singleton, who had offered me a job to call football previously. And we sealed the deal in about October, November of 2001. I started on air at 2GB Christmas Eve 2001, doing breakfast of all things, because they were still negotiating with Alan to come from 2UE to 2GB. Mm-hmm. And then in late February, early March, word came through that Alan had signed with 2GB and had left 2UE after a very successful career to do breakfast. And at that stage, I thought, you beauty, I don't have to get up early anymore. And then I was just to call the football, and I brought my team across from 2UE, the continuous call team. And Singo and John Brennan prevailed upon me to do morning radio. And I said, no, I can't. And then eventually Singo made it worth my while to say yes, so I did it. And the first question he said is, who do we get to call the football? And I said, well, what do you mean? He said, well, you can't work 7 days a week. And I said, well, I'm going to have to, because I've brought these other fellows over with me, and I can't just ring them up now and say good luck on Saturdays and Sundays. I'm doing another job. So for that next 10 years, from 2002 to 2012, I did work 7 days a week through the football season. Wow. And I know it's a hackneyed cliche, Sean, but the harder I worked, the luckier I got. And it was predicated on Alan Jones' success at breakfast. And then eventually I started to grow my own audience. But without Alan's, Alan took breakfast from 2 or 3% at 2GB to 11 very quickly, then to 12, then to 15, then to 16. And eventually in 2003, after about 3 servos, I beat John Laws, who was still at 2UE, on the back of Alan's success. And then, I then acquired the skills and the experience to, be there in my own right. And subsequently, the last survey we did before COVID-19, I had 18.8%.
Wow.
Alan had about 17.7, and we'll find out what happens on September the 29th. Now Alan's is gone. See whether I can maintain that success.
So you do 3 hours of solo live radio each day. It's got to be incredibly demanding. Like, how do you prepare for it? What's your day look like?
Well, I'd say to anyone aspiring to be a radio broadcaster, get up early. At the moment, I'm broadcasting from home where I am right now, but my day would normally start at 3:15 if I was in at the studios, and I'd be at work by about 4:45. And it works even better at home because I get up at 4:15, I have a shower, and I walk down the hallway, and I'm at work at 4:45 still. So most radio broadcasters would tell you that if you do a 3-hour show, you should do 3 hours of preparation. I've always done 4 hours of preparation, and I'll continue to do so because I think you've got to think on your feet. You've got to be able to, obviously ad lib, but you've got to have a basis of information in the back of your mind so that you can do all of that. And you can't just keep reading scripts, although you do from time to time because there are things that might slip your mind. But most of it's off the top of your head from recollection. And
how do you keep on top of it there?
Well, I've been I'm not blessed in many areas, but I'm very blessed with a good retention. And that goes back to me being a sports commentator and retaining names for race calling and rugby league. So I've got a good retention, and I retain things, and things just pop into my mind. But I think that's probably where I'm very lucky compared to other people, that I can retain things and remember things. And even things will pop into my mind doing a program about something that happened a number of years ago, and I can almost recollect it exactly as to what happened. I sometimes refresh my memory. Dr. Google's very helpful these days. But
great skill, though.
I'm very lucky that I can do that.
And the job certainly comes with profile and some notoriety, I'd say, and perhaps even fame. Do you like that part of it?
Not necessarily. There have been incidents in my career where my family have been the subject of much discussion, and obviously a broken marriage 6 years ago, the subject of much discussion, and things that have happened to my children as adults, the subject of much discussion. They can do without that, but they understand that because they're my children, there'll be focus on them. And I mean, even at the moment, I say to them, look, for goodness sake, don't get caught out, with the COVID-19, not social distancing, because if you were just, Daniel or Laura or, Sarah from the suburbs, no one would care. But because your last name's Hadley, you're going to be subject to some, fairly stringent observations from print media. So, look, I'll say this to you, Sean, and I really mean this sincerely. I'll retire eventually. I won't go on forever. And the one thing I won't miss is the attention. Particularly the focus on my family, particularly now as a grandfather. I won't miss that. I don't crave that attention. It comes with the territory. I'm a media animal. I understand what it's all about. I understand the attention. I understand why people are interested in what I do. I think that someone once told me at the Daily Telegraph that I'm clickbait. That if they mention my name, either disparagingly or in a positive nature, people tend to click onto me to see what I've done now or what mistakes I've made or whether whether they like me or hate me. I'm clickbait. So I understand that. But the day I walk out and the day I don't have to be answerable to people in relation to that, it means that probably I've had 40 years of that. Not as much as I have over the last 20. The first half was pretty normal as a lowly ranked broadcaster and then eventually a football commentator. But the second half of my career has been at times very difficult to deal with. But I've dealt with it, and I deal with it still today. I mean, there are things that are happening in my life at the moment I'd rather not deal with, but I deal with them and get through them. And I think from time to time you can all be a bit inward looking. I was probably reflecting on some things this week, and I got a note from a father and a mother whose son's a serving police officer, 42, and I'd met him a number of times, and he'd battled cancer, and he beat cancer, according to his mum and dad, and they wrote to me gleefully about 2 years ago and said, Shannon's through the worst of it, and he's married, and Nikki's his wife's great. they wrote to me yesterday to tell me that he'd been awarded a distinguished medal by the Commissioner of Police in New South Wales.
Wow.
But he'll pass away sometime in the next 6 months because of the cancer returning. And that puts things in perspective.
Yep.
I mean, you think, and that father said to me in an email, and I've met the dad, Ray, if I could take his place, I would. I would. I'd volunteer my life for his life. He's only 42. I've lived my life. And you start to reflect back on, well, are things really that tough for me? And they're not. They're not. I'm most fortunate compared to others in terms of health and a whole range of other things. But, every now and then we all need a bit of a liven up about other people less fortunate than ourselves.
Now, one of your great skills is I'll listen to you talking to the Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, just as much as I listen to you talking to Cam Smith, who's probably the greatest current rugby league player. Do you think much about your audience when you're talking to the PM or the footy player? Like, is it the same for you, or do you think differently about it?
No, well, I suppose you've got to be more respectful when you're talking to the Prime Minister, because you're talking to a position, not just a man or a woman.
Yeah.
But, I mean, it's been a bit easier more recently, because even though I've had some battles with Mr Morrison when he wasn't Prime Minister, I banned him. But anyway, that ban was lifted, and hopefully and thankfully he accepted the unlifting of the ban, or the lifting of the ban. But, I mean, no, what I try to do, and John Brennan told me this, probably 35 years ago, just pretend you're in a conversation with someone, at a pub or a club or in a room somewhere, and you're having a yarn. The fact that there may be hundreds of thousands of people listening to that yarn is immaterial. You conduct yourself. And the other thing that I always carry with me is another memory from another great broadcaster like Gary O'Callaghan, now, of course, deceased. And in the very early stages, I was his traffic reporter back in the early 80s. And I thought there must have been some magic formula to being a successful radio broadcaster. I thought there's got to be that little thing that I don't know about, because I'm not knowledgeable like Gary. And I said to him one day, Gary, you've had all this success, for more than a decade as the number one radio host in Sydney, and what's the secret? And I thought, I'll get this unbelievable story revealed to me and I'll be able to cling to it for the rest of my career. And he looked at me, and he was a lovely man, Gary. He said, what's your name? And I thought, well, you know my name. I said, well, I'm Ray Hadley. He said, do you think you can be Ray Hadley? And I said, oh, yeah, I can do that. He said, there's a secret. He said, when you're sad, cry. When you're happy, laugh. When you're angry, be angry. Don't ever pretend at any time behind the microphone, because despite what people might tell you about TV, the microphone can always detect your insincerity. It can always detect that you're not being fair dinkum. And that's something I've clung to since about 1982.
Wow, great advice. Great advice. Now, I can't let you go without talking a little bit of sport. Is rugby league or racing your favourite? I mean, if you had a favourite sport, what is it?
Well, look, if you can call racing, you can call anything.
Yep.
It's the hardest job in the world. And I found it very difficult, even though that's what I wanted to be. And I remember John Tapp's advice to me in late 86, early 87, when they offered me the job at TUE to call the football. And he said, son, you've got a choice here. You can call 22 horses for a minute and a half, or you can call 26 players for 90 minutes. What do you think is easier? And I said, yeah, you're probably right about that. The strains on race callers, particularly these days with the younger blokes, with replays and replays and replays, and if you get one horse's name wrong and you get it in the wrong position, you get crucified by the punters. Rugby league is much more forgiving because it's just slower pace and things like that. I remember I was invited to go out to a picnic meeting near Penrith at Mulgoa, actually. And the people that put it on said, would you come out here and call some races? This is about 5 years ago. And I said, I haven't called races since the 1990s. I last called a race in 1994 and 1995, except for a couple of novelty things I did, greyhound races that happened back in about 10, 12 years ago. So I went out there, and it was only a picnic meeting, and there was only a couple of thousand people there, and it wasn't broadcast anywhere else. But I said, how much to pay? I said, no, I don't need money. I want to see if I can still do it.
Yeah, right.
And I got through the program of 7 races, and there were only 10 starters in every race, which is very simple to do normally. And I climbed down from the scaffold at the end of it and thought, my God, I'm glad I don't do this anymore. It's just too hard.
Did you pick it off the colours?
Yeah, always the colours. Yeah, so what you do when the jockeys come into the enclosure, you look at the colours. and you just keep repeating the names of the horse, and those colours coincide with the name of the horse, and you just keep repeating it. And then on the way to the barrier, you probably had 5 minutes of repeating it, then another 5 minutes on the way to the barrier. And by the 15 minutes that they go into the barrier, from the time they come to the saddling enclosure, you should be able to learn, 25 or 26 horses as they do in the Melbourne Cup. The powers of concentration required for race calling are probably more intense than 3 hours of talkback radio I currently do.
Now, look, just finally, COVID-19, I mean, how do you think the sport has generally reacted to it? Now, at the moment in New South Wales and Queensland, we'd normally be talking about state of origin right now, I'd imagine, but rugby league, that's not happening till November. I think it's after the season anyway. How do you think the NRL and the AFL and A-League and basketball, golf, etc. have done responding to it and pretty much keeping the codes going, really?
Oh, I think it's a damn miracle. When Volandis was my old boss at Harold Park when I was calling the trots back in the 1980s.
There's a great connection.
That's how long I've known. Well, he was a promising young administrator. Now he's the best sporting administrator in this part of the world, I'd imagine, when you take racing and rugby league into account. But when he first started telling me that he was going to do this, I said to him, Pete, you're mad. I said, I don't know how long this COVID-19 is going to last. They tell me it's going to be 12 or 18 months before we get some sort of vaccination. But it's fanciful to think that you're going to get the confidence. Well, he said, I'll show you. And then he rang me a couple of times. He said, I need some help. And I said, what do you need? He said, you've got access to Peter Dutton. We've got to travel players from New Zealand to here and all. I said, I can put you in contact with him, but I can't do much more. You'll have to explain him what you've got in mind. So I did that. And then somehow he convinced Anastasia Palaszczuk, when the whole of New South Wales was in lockdown, that he could bring rugby league teams into Queensland. And then Gil McLachlan, the same thing happened with the AFL. And now they've transferred everyone to Queensland, obviously in light of more recent events. But I'm absolutely amazed that, everything. And Volandis kept racing going. It looked like racing was going to close down. He kept it going, and then he applied the same rules to rugby league. And you're right, Origin will be sometime in November, I'd imagine. They've got 3 dates set a week apart for Origin if it does happen and things don't go belly up in the meantime. But I'm absolutely amazed. Volandis the most incredible person I've ever known. He's so persuasive. He seems to be able to convince everyone.
And persistent.
From prime ministers down to premiers to sporting administrators. And it seems to me the harder it is to do, the more hope he is of doing it. I've never seen, I thought I saw the best in Ken Arthurson in rugby league and John Quayle back in the 80s through the 90s, through the Super League war and all the rest of that stuff. But in watching Volandis, I don't know where he gets the energy to do what he does, but he does it quite successfully. And my admiration has grown for him in more recent months by what he's done. And the same with AFL. They've done an incredible job to think that, particularly as they've got a competition that goes across the country from Western Australia, South Australia, Victoria, then up to Queensland and New South Wales. At least Peter's only got to deal with teams in Queensland, New South Wales, the ACT and Victoria. But the other people have got to deal with it much more difficult.
And tell me, I know you're a golfer. Are you still golfing? Have you been able to?
Well, you wouldn't believe it. I'm going to have a hit this week for the first time in 3 weeks. Now, Sean, I can tell you that my sanity is kept by golf. I play 3 times a week, sometimes 4 if I'm allowed to. And I haven't played for 3 weeks because I was up in Queensland broadcasting for 2 weeks. And then I got back to beautiful Sydney and the rain started. Well, of course, they closed the course on me, didn't they? So I'm hopeful that the course will open in the next 24 hours and I'll get back out there. But that's my, unfortunately, my partner, Sophie. Our wedding, by the way, has now been put back for the 5th time. We were supposed to get married in June, then in August, and then October. It's back again to March, and then it's back from March again. But I've got her convinced that she should play golf with me. So we have a game together every Sunday and have great fun together. But I've got a group of mates, probably 6 in total. I play with the different mates at different times in groups of 4. But in difficult times, it's been my escape. It's where I go to escape. I don't take the phone with me. It's left in the car. And I just, for 4.5 hours, don't have a care in the world. And I look forward to the time when, that'll be a major focus for me, when I don't have other things to deal with, but just whether I can still hit the driver as far as I used to.
And you mentioned playing with your partner there. So one final question. The Women's World Cup of Football is coming to Australia. Is that exciting?
Oh, fantastic! I mean, any international event, the World Cup in that code of football is as big as it gets. And look, I grew up with men playing rugby league and men playing soccer, and men playing AFL, men playing rugby union. And, you know, I'm not a cranky old bloke, although some people would dispute that. I love the girls.
Yeah.
I love the physicality of the girls that play rugby league. I love the absolute grace of them, you know, and the speed and all the rest of it. And the same with our brilliant soccer team. I love watching them. I'm a great netball fan. I mean, people think netball's some sort of sedate woman's sport. You go and watch the Swifts or something like that in Sydney or the other teams nationally. I mean, those girls are tough. They are tough.
Yeah.
And they stop on a sixpence and they break their ankles and tear ligaments and do a whole range of other things. If you want to play top-level sport, particularly netball, you've got to be a very tough sports person. And, I love the fact, you know, I embrace women's sport. I love it. I was always the greatest moment in my broadcasting career involved a woman. It was Kathy Freeman in the year 2000. Yep. September the 25th, I'll never forget it. 105,000 people as she stormed down the back straight of the Olympic Stadium and then took gold. And if I go to my grave with that memory in the back of my mind, and every time I hear the broadcast, the hairs on the back of my neck still stand up because it takes me back to being a much younger man and at the height of my career and to think that I had the pleasure of broadcasting the Olympics. I did 6 in total, but I did the Olympics in my home city. So when I finished that race and when I finished doing the other track and field of the swimming with Ian Thorpe and the 4x100, I went and slept in my own bed and then came back to work the next day. Just a great, great experience.
Ray, thanks for talking to Fear and Greed.
It's a great pleasure. All the best. Thanks, Sean. I appreciate your time.
That was Sydney's King of the Airways, Ray Hadley.